I would tell them something Albert Einstein said. Einstein said we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking that we use to create the problems. So Obama went to big businesses a couple years ago looking for solutions and couldn't find any. You're right.
Well, he ignored them. That's what happened.
Absolutely.
He ignored what they said.
He's ignored small business.
Well, go right ahead.
Well, the Census Bureau says small businesses are responsible for 90% of the net new jobs. And we need to be looking at programs to channel existing federal infrastructure spending to small businesses. It's going to allow the Pentagon's largest prime contractors to circumvent federal contracting law. Small businesses are going to lose billions of dollars over this, and the program needs to be eliminated. And I think the fact that the Pentagon is now admitting after 25 years that it doesn't work, Congress admits that it doesn't work. Professor Charles Tiefer issued a legal opinion a few months ago that called it a sham, and it's harmful to small businesses. And I'm really disappointed in Congress and the President that they renew this into its 20th year of testing. Think about how just outrageous it is to test whether eliminating all transparency and all penalties for prime contractors not complying with our small business goals is going to help small businesses even for a week, much less 25 years. So the notion that they've tested this for 25 years to me is outrageous. It needs to end. And I'd like to see the GAO do an investigation into it, quite frankly. Well, you know, Sikorsky has now intervened to try to block the release of the data. There's a hearing on January 15th at the Federal District Court in San Francisco. They're trying to block it, and then they've got until the 22nd to release it. I predicted, by the way, that they wouldn't release the information because they wanted to get the program renewed. And I think the information would have been so devastating that it would have blocked the renewal. So Sikorsky, I don't really think has a position to intervene. In 1994, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in California ruled that defense contractors cannot withhold small business subcontracting data. So the fact that the Pentagon is fighting to block it, the Solicitor General actually got involved in the case, and now Sikorsky, I think that's very telling that the information is very damaging. If the information was just run-of-the-mill, bland small business subcontracting data, it would have been released. But again, I want people to realize not one person in America has seen any information on this program in a quarter of a century. And I think that they're fighting so hard to block it because I think it's going to be devastating. In fact, I actually believe this could be the largest example of fraud at the Pentagon in U.S. history. I think it's real simple. The U.S. Census Bureau tells us that small businesses create 95% of all net new jobs. And there's a federal law that says 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses, and yet there's been, I think, 25 investigations to show that that's not happening. So there's a new bill in Congress called H.R. 2568 that will stop the government from giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 corporations. That'll redirect about $100 billion a year in current federal infrastructure spending to the middle-class economy. I think that's the most effective thing that anyone's proposed so far. Well, CIT is a 100-year-old lender. They've been the top SBA 7A lender for 9 consecutive years. They're the top lender for women, minorities, and veterans for 6 consecutive years. And I think they've got just under 1 million companies that they're lending to. And with the economy the kind of state it's in right now, and considering the fact that small businesses are responsible for 95% of the new jobs and over 50% of the gross domestic product, I think it would be a real shame if we let CIT fail right now. Well, I'm not saying that they're good at what they do. I'm saying that I think right now, with the economy and the kind of situation it's in right now, it would be unfortunate if a company like CIT, again, 100 years of expertise of loaning to small businesses, I just think it would be a mistake. And I think that a lot of financial institutions that really were less deserving of being saved than CIT have been rescued. So, by the way, I was against both of the bailout bills. I was against the TARP bill. But if we're going to use tax dollars to rescue banks, I'd want my tax dollars used to rescue the #1 lender to small business in the country. I'm a small business advocate. You can't blame me for feeling that. But, you know, there's no guarantee. But again, you know, when I see a company that's 100 years old that's the #1 lender to small businesses, you know, I'm concerned about that. But I'll tell you, this will probably be the last time that I'm going to support the bailout of any financial institution. This will be the last time that I will, you know, come out like this. I think you hit the nail on the head.
We're in the middle of a recession. The banks got, was it $2.5 trillion of our tax dollars to increase access to capital for small businesses. They're making billions. Unemployment's going up, and access to capital to small businesses have been reduced. So the complete opposite of what we were told was going to happen is happening. And all the politicians went on television and said, we need to pass this legislation to increase access to capital for small businesses, and it's not happening. Well, that's a good question. That's one of my favorite questions. Why are small businesses so voiceless? Let's look at the groups that say they represent small businesses. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says they have 3 million members and 96% have less than 100 employees. What are they saying about this? The NFIB, I believe their websites, they claim to be the voice of small business. Where are they? So, yeah, small businesses don't have a voice because all the groups that supposedly represent small businesses, in my opinion, are actually funded by Fortune 500 corporations and lobby for Fortune 500 corporations. And the fact that these things are happening to small businesses, I think, is proof that small businesses don't have the representation in this country and in Congress that they should have. Unemployment's going up. Your previous guest just talked about the fact that interest rates are going up. Access to capital appears to be being reduced. You know, Business Week and the New York Times have reported on that. So, in fact, quite frankly, just last week, some federal programs for small businesses are being dismantled. So it doesn't look good for small businesses to me for the rest of the year when you look at the federal programs, some of them being dismantled, the access to capital actually being reduced. All right, I've got a member that's been in business for 20 years. They're have one of the best credit ratings you can possibly have, and American Express cut their credit card limit in half for no reason with no explanation.
Did that put them out of business? Is that hurting them, or are they going to go out of business?
Oh, they're not going to go out of business, but it's not helping.
Right.
In fact, quite frankly, when I talked to this person the other day, they said, you know, where's the increased access to capital? You know, we spent $2.5 trillion to increase access to capital, and what I'm hearing every day is a reduction in access to capital. They need it really bad. So far, about only 1% of the bailout money has gone to small businesses, and that's shocking when you realize that 95% of all new jobs come from small businesses and half of the gross domestic product, and only 1%, so 99% of all the money so far has gone to big businesses. It's unbelievable. Well, you know, it could be. I hate to think about loaning money to small businesses being toxic. Small businesses, you know, are not guilty of the type of horrible things that we've seen in the financial industry. No one, you know, worries about loaning them money. Small businesses aren't giving, you know, their executives, you know, bonuses that bankrupt the company. Well, yeah. In fact, again, when you realize the amount of money they're talking about giving small businesses is really sort of infinitesimal in comparison. So if they took every dime of the TARP funds that are unallocated, which is $127 billion, and give every penny of it to small businesses, that would be 5% of the total bailout funds. And that's to the small businesses that create 95% of all new jobs. Well, you know, small business owners have just had layer and layer and layer of difficulty, and it's going to make it, you know, hard for a lot of small businesses. A lot of people don't realize when you hear about someone making $350,000, people out there middle class go, gosh, you know, you must be rich. Quite frankly, that's not a lot of money for a small business to make when you realize they lose half of it to taxes, and they've got a finance receivable. So if you have a small business where you're selling a product that you have to finance, you know, that's really not much money. So it's going to be just another burden for small businesses. We've been fighting with the government now for 5 years to simply find out who's really getting these contracts, and they're not very excited about people knowing that some of the biggest companies in the world are actually getting small business contracts. The NFIB surveyed their members, and their member says we want orders, not loans. The American Small Business League surveyed our members. 95% of our members want the government contracts they're supposed to get, not loans. I've got a report here from the Federal Oversight Panel slams Obama's small business plans. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about lending small businesses money when the largest federal program to direct infrastructure spending to the middle class is the Small Business Act. I think they're going to get worse. And when you think about the Obama administration policies about small business and what he cares about small businesses, 12 investigations have showed up to $1 million a minute in federal funds that by law should go to small businesses are being diverted to some of the biggest companies in the world. And that's actually much more important than the situation with lending. Right. That needs to be stopped, and we need more attention on that issue. Well, there's over 26 million small businesses in America. They create over 80% of the new jobs, and most Americans work for small businesses, and yet if you look at Barack Obama's latest website, you won't find much for small businesses there. On the campaign website, he puts small business issues at a very low priority between seniors and sportsmen, and I just think that's the wrong place for issues about small businesses to when you're looking at the type of economy we're looking at. We're looking at the worst economic situation America's seen in many, many years. And if you want to create jobs in America, you need to start with small businesses. And I think Barack Obama is really going back a lot of his campaign promises he made to small businesses. Well, yeah, we endorsed him during the primary, and I did, dozens of radio shows for President-elect Obama. And about 3 weeks before the election, he dropped all of his small business proposals that we'd worked on for several months. We were part of his Small Business Council, and we worked with small business people all around the country to put forth issues that would help stimulate the economy and create jobs in small businesses. And about 3 weeks before the election, he dropped them all. And in fact, the main one he dropped that we were upset about is in February, he said that he didn't think Fortune 500 corporations should get government small business contracts, and that's one of our main issues. But just days after making that statement, he dropped any reference to it. And if you go look at his change.gov website now, you won't find any mention of Barack Obama's promise last February to America's 26 million small businesses to stop the flow of government small business contracts to, as he said, corporate giants. He can't. In fact, one thing that we're very concerned about is I'm predicting that Barack Obama will sign federal legislation that will actually create a loophole that will allow wealthy venture capitalists that were major supporters of the Democratic Party to participate in government small business contracting programs. And I was not happy when I saw that he nominated Karen Mills, a large venture capitalist from New York, to head the Small Business Administration. I think that's a clear signal that he does intend to adopt federal policies that will divert federal small business contracts away from the small businesses where most Americans work and into the hands of some very wealthy venture capitalists that were major contributors to the Democratic Party. Well, you know, I saw Carly Fiorina and Laura Tyson on television yesterday, and they were saying that the best way to create jobs in America and boost the economy is for the government to spend infrastructure dollars with those small businesses. And there's an existing federal program that's been on the books since 1953 that says 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses. And since 2002, there's been 15 investigations that found that most of those government small business contracts actually go to Fortune 500 corporations. So if Barack Obama wants to stimulate the economy and create jobs in America, he needs to stop the government from giving small business contracts to big businesses and try to infuse those federal infrastructure dollars into the hands of the small businesses where most Americans work, and that'll create jobs in this country. Well, the U.S. Census Bureau says 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees. And that's my definition of a small business. When you walk around the neighborhood you live in, you know, you can kind of tell what a small business is. But today, the federal government is literally giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 corporations. And I think that needs to stop. You're talking about $200 billion a year. And the SBA Inspector General has described it as one of the largest challenges facing the SBA and the entire federal government today. So it's a huge problem. It's pulling trillions of dollars out of the middle class economy in the last decade. And I've been fighting for about 15 years now to try to stop it. You see a lot of politicians talking about how important small businesses are in the middle class. But the reality is the Small Business Act is the largest economic stimulus program for the middle class in history. Yeah. It's 100 times larger than TARP or the American Reinvestment Recovery Act. But it's just been corrupted and basically repealed through this corruption. You know, that's a good question. How are they getting away with it? You know, I really wish that Congress would, you know, stop this, but it's just very hard to get legislation passed to stop it. When you're talking about Verizon, Lockheed, Boeing, and Northrop, Raytheon, General Dynamics.
They've got big lobbying groups. Now, you have proposed legislation, though, correct?
Yes, I wrote a bill about 7 years ago called the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act that will simply stop the federal government
from giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. I guess something that probably 99% of Americans would agree. Yeah. And they go to our website, ASBL.com.
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 Okay.
And I've got a website, LloydChapman.com, with all their stories we've done on television. But yeah, contact your congressman, contact Senator Boxer, Senator Feinstein. And it's something that's really affecting the middle class in a significant way.
We're talking a lot of money.
Yeah. It's about $2 trillion, I think, in the last 10 years. Well, CIT has been the #1 SBA 7A lender for 9 consecutive years. They're the top lender to women, minorities, and veterans for 6 consecutive years. So a failure by CIT would be catastrophic, and I don't think the government should allow them to fail. They're a good institution. They're well run, and I think it would be devastating if something were to happen to CIT. They're irreplaceable, I think. If President Obama were to take every dime of the remaining TARP funds that are available that have not been allocated, which I believe is $127 billion, that would mean that the small businesses in America that are responsible for 50% of the GDP and 95% of all new jobs would have gotten 5% of all the economic recovery funds. That's ridiculous. Half the GDP, 95% of all new jobs, and if they gave them 100% of the unallocated funds. So the amount of money that's been given small businesses, I would say, is statistically insignificant, and it needs to go up dramatically. Well, you know, here's the way I look at it. The purpose of the economic stimulus plan is to try to rescue the economy. And again, small businesses are responsible for 95% of the new jobs. CIT is the #1 SBA 7A lender. We can't let them fail. They don't need that much money, quite frankly. They got $2.3 billion. What was it? JP Morgan got $25 billion. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't take that much to save them. And I think that we definitely should. One of your previous guests said that half the GDP comes from small businesses. As you said, over 95% of all new jobs come from small businesses. To put it into perspective, small businesses have gotten around 0.2% of all the bailout funds, where Wall Street executives got, I think, $18.4 billion last year. Small businesses are getting less than $1 billion. It's just, it's ridiculous. You know, in the last 7 years, there's been 12 federal investigations that found the largest problem facing the Small Business Administration was the diversion of up to $100 billion a year in federal small business contracts to large businesses. The U.S. Chamber hasn't said a word in 1 year. Notice that Giovanni thinks it's great that the companies that are responsible for half the GDP and over 95% of all the new jobs are getting less than 1% of the bailout bill. Well, they've directed all the money to large corporations. So even though small businesses create 100% of all the net new jobs, and most Americans work for small businesses, they've only gotten about 3% of the stimulus funds. So the answer to your question, that's by design. That's how the Obama administration designed it. And worse than that, there's existing federal programs that are supposed to direct about $150 billion a year in federal infrastructure spending to small businesses, and that's being diverted to Fortune 500 corporations. So small businesses are really
struggling. But why is that happening? Was that the intention or just like an unintended consequence?
Well, to tell you the truth, it's happening because the government has adopted policies, as crazy as it may seem, to allow Fortune 500 firms to get federal small business contracts. And there's been a dozen investigations that have reported that. It's been named the #1 challenge at the SBA, and yet Congress has refused to act on it. Even President Obama, during the campaign, said it's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants, but he hasn't done anything.
But Linda, to be fair, though.
Well, I think he's right. You have to realize 90% of all U.S. firms have less than 20 employees, and the surveys show that their #1 problem is not an access to capital, but it's customers walking the door, it's orders, it's sales. And that's really the one thing the government has not addressed. So we spent $3 trillion to stimulate the economy, increase access to capital, but the real problem is small businesses, you know, their sales are down, they're laying people off, and the federal government is not addressing the fact that we're not directing enough federal infrastructure spending to small businesses. That's really the only thing that's going to make a difference, I think. There's 27 million small businesses in America. They employ 56% of the population, and they create 100% of the net new jobs. And yet the SBA's budget now is less than it was when Ronald Reagan was president. So I think one of the solutions to trying to stimulate the economy and create jobs is to probably quadruple the SBA budget so they can implement the federal programs that have been in place. There's actually a multitude of really great programs that, if they were properly implemented, would create jobs and stimulate the economy, but the SBA's budget is so small And again, the SBA Inspector General has said for 5 consecutive years that the #1 problem at the SBA is the fact that Fortune 500 firms are getting all the money that by law should be going to the middle class. So, you know, that needs to be addressed. There's also a bill in Congress called the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act, H.R. 2568, that's been written to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to large businesses and redirect about $100 billion a year into the middle class. That piece of legislation would do more to stimulate the economy and create jobs than anything that President Obama has proposed. It's H.R. 2568, the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act. In fact, I'll tell you something. Large businesses haven't created one net new job since 1977. So when you look at federal infrastructure spending, I think it's important to realize that huge volumes of federal infrastructure spending, both for contracts and subcontracts, are in amounts of less than $2,000 and $3,000. So you don't need to build bridges and roads to stimulate the economy. You can buy, you know, office supplies and computers and things like that. But a huge amount of federal spending is in very, very small amounts. People don't understand that, and that should all be directed to small businesses. 100% of it should go to small businesses, and there's no reason not to do that. So that's the only thing that President Obama and Congress have failed to do, which is redirect this infrastructure spending back to the small businesses where 100% of the jobs are created. Well, you know, the facts are that small business bankruptcies are up over 44% since last year. Home foreclosures are up to 3.9 million. We lost, what was it, I don't know, 4 million jobs last year.
Right.
And small businesses are cutting jobs for the 23rd consecutive month. So it doesn't look good to me. I don't think the stimulus plan is working, and it's not surprising. You're talking about small business creation. The U.S. Census Bureau says small businesses are responsible for something like 95% of net new jobs. Well, I don't know if I can agree with that. I just, you know, I look at the basic, you know, premise, you know, again, that there's no question that small businesses create the overwhelming majority of new jobs. They're getting no money from the government, as you know from talking to me before. Today, the federal government will give about $500 million in federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. The SBA is at the lowest staffing and budget, I think, in 30 years, or one of the lowest levels in 30 years. And so you just don't see the government focusing attention on small businesses. Before the commercial, there was a congressman, I don't remember his name, was talking about they're going to focus on job creation. Well, there's a bill in Congress right now called the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act, H.R. 2568. It's got 20 co-sponsors. That bill would create more jobs and put more money into the middle-class economy than anything anyone's proposed, and they're dragging their feet on it. So I just don't think Congress really understands the mistake they're making by not focusing more attention on small businesses. Well, we're probably dealing with both. But 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees. That's a definition that I like, you know, for small businesses. And I just think, you know, again, to put it into perspective, I think CIT is the largest lender to small businesses and woman-owned firms, minority-owned firms in the country.
Right.
And that's going to have a much bigger impact on entrepreneurs, for example, than the venture capital industry. And again, the stimulus funds and federal programs. So although it's a problem, comparatively speaking, I think it's a fairly minor problem. I'm just so tired, just like so many people. I'm so disappointed, but it's time that needs to change. I seriously doubt it. There's too much disagreement on some of the most important issues like how to pay for it. So I doubt it very seriously if that's going to happen. Absolutely. In fact, a lot of people don't realize 8% is a huge amount of money. A lot of businesses operate on a profit margin that's 8%. So to pay an 8% payroll tax could put a lot of people out of business. But my concern is that, to me, this is just not the right time to try to offer universal health care. We're fighting 2 wars. We're in the worst economic downturn in 80 years. And to put more financial burden on small businesses, to me, that just seems like a bad time. I'm in favor of universal health care. I think it'd be great. But, boy, this just doesn't seem like the best time in our nation's history to try to solve that right now. Absolutely, yes. There's no question we need to do something. But I just wish we could do something, quite frankly, to address the problem maybe from the other end, to try to lower the cost of health care in some way, make the delivery more efficient. But I'm just not in favor of anything that's going to put more burden on small businesses. People need to realize that the $2.7 billion that's been spent to stimulate the economy, small businesses have received, I think, 0.3%. Yeah. And it's just very hard for small businesses, I think, to try to shoulder any more financial burden right now. But yet, we need to do something. It's a dilemma. I don't think anyone's going to come up with a solution that's going to be, widely accepted.
Right.
You're going to make somebody mad no matter what you do. But I just wish they would try to look at it from another angle of how we can lower the cost of health care, not raise the taxes on small businesses to pay for it.
Well, I have been fighting the government for 7 years to try to stop them from giving government small business contracts to Fortune 500 companies and even some of the biggest companies in Europe. And so when President Obama promised to help us with that issue, we endorsed him. I donated money to his campaign. I used to get up at 4:30 in the morning and do radio shows all across the country campaigning for him. I met him. I talked to him about this. I thought the problem was going to be over. And as soon as he got elected, he actually changed his website to make it look like he'd never made that statement. I'm glad you asked that question, Bill. There's been 15 federal investigations that found that Fortune 500 corporations are, in fact, the recipients of most federal small business contracts. In fact, the SBA Inspector General's office released an investigation a few years ago that referred to it as one of the biggest challenges facing the Small Business Administration and the entire federal government today. So it's a big, big problem. Well, they're wrong. They're wrong. That money is really not going to small businesses. You can talk to any small business out there in America and ask them. But they're also allowing $400 million each and every day in federal contracts that, by law, should go to small businesses to go to some of the biggest companies in the world. And there's been 15 investigations. So, you can listen to me, you can listen to the White House. But if you look at the SBA Inspector General, the General Accounting Office, the SBA Office of Advocacy, the Inspector General for the Department of Interior, they all agree with me that Fortune 500 corporations are in fact getting small business contracts. A lot of people in Congress have written a piece of legislation called the Small Business Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act. A lot of people like you in the media. I've had this story in every major newspaper in the country. And hopefully, if people want to know more about it, they can go to info@strongervoice.org, and get involved in it. Well, I asked President Obama to simply end the diversion of billions of dollars in federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. And he and his campaign agreed, and they issued a statement that said it's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. And he's refused to honor that promise, and as a result, every day, millions of dollars in federal contracts that should be going to the small businesses where most Americans work, where most of the gross domestic product come from, and over 90% of the net new jobs has been diverted to companies in Europe, even in Asia, and big businesses in America. For example, the Obama administration is giving U.S. government small business contracts to Finmeccanica, an Italian defense contractor with about 76,000 employees. I think most Americans would agree that's a travesty, and that needs to stop, and he's not doing it. You know what? The Small Business Administration says it's anomalies. So every day that President Obama has been in office, millions of dollars in small business contracts have been diverted to Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, Finmeccanica, Sanjong Corporation in South Korea, and they say it's an anomaly. They said the other day in an investigation by NBC that it was an anomaly, and it's just not believable. In fact, the SBA's own Inspector General says it's fraud. And I'd like to see the Justice Department look into this. It's a great issue for Mitt Romney to look into, because I think everyone out there today would agree with me that we should not be giving federal small business contracts to the biggest companies in the world. I'm shocked at some of the federal regulations that they apply to small businesses. It's really amazing. People need to understand small businesses are the economic engine of our country. They're responsible for most of the jobs, most of the gross domestic product, over 90% of all U.S. exports. And small businesses have just been ignored by President Obama, and they're oppressive. A lot of the policies are just really unbelievable, and they're very hard for small businesses to respond to all those different policies.
Yeah.
But I hope that this issue comes out in the election. It needs to be a very important issue.
that President Obama and Mitt Romney discussed in the campaign? Absolutely. In fact, the U.S. Census Bureau says 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees, and those companies employ about 60% of our nation's population. That's correct. About 95% of all new jobs in America are created by companies with less than 100 employees. Little guy's out of luck. The only agency in Washington that's there to help small businesses is the Small Business Administration. And that agency has had their budget cut to the point that I've had SB executives tell me that they can barely keep the lights on. So you had a good point a while ago, Glenn. You were talking about how the government is investing so much money in propping up all these big businesses, when in reality, here in America, most Americans work for small businesses. That's where all the new jobs come from, and that's where the country should be investing money. But I don't know if you've seen it, but in the last, I guess 5 years, about 12 federal investigations have come out and found that up to $100 billion a year in federal funds that by law should be going to small businesses have been diverted to Fortune 500 corporations. There was a story just last week from the Department of the Interior that showed that that agency diverted millions of dollars to Fortune 500 corporations, even companies in Europe. So, well, you know, that's a good question. But, you know, today, while you and I are talking, our government is giving federal small business contracts not only to Fortune 500 corporations, but some of the biggest companies in Europe. Again, there's been 12 federal investigations into it, and it's been on most of the major television networks, and it's been in all the major newspapers. I do about 30 radio shows a month talking about it, but there's been no legislation. So two things we need here in America for small businesses is we need the Small Business Administration budget restored, and probably have that agency's budget, you know, quadrupled. And then we need legislation to stop the federal government from giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 companies, because that's where most Americans work.
All right.
Absolutely. There's not a word in this bill that's going to increase sales for small businesses in this country.
Well, that wouldn't be the job of the government anyway.
Well, yeah, you know, there's a federal law that says 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses. There's been a series of investigations for 5 years that say most of the small business contracts go to Fortune 500 firms. If President Obama wants to stimulate the economy, he needs to, you know, stop giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 corporations and do something to increase the sales of small businesses. There's not a word in this bill to do that. In fact, this bill looks like it was written by the lobbyists for the National Venture Capital Association. This bill is just full of loopholes for venture capitalists. Well, if you've got a business and you're losing, you know, $5,000 a month, you know, you don't need a loan. You need more sales. You know, and this bill, by the way, has a loophole, section 1341, paragraph 4, that could repeal the most aggressive stimulus plan that's ever been passed, the Small Business Act. And this section essentially legalizes contracting fraud. I can't believe this. I read this last night and I was just stunned. Section 1341. Somebody needs to read this. This could repeal the federal law that says 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses and allow the biggest companies in the world to hijack these programs and get away with it. I can't believe it. I'm stunned. I've never seen a worse piece of legislation in my life.
So even though the spin is this bill is designed to help small businesses, it would be in small business best interest to oppose it?
Absolutely. This, quite frankly, I'll go ahead and say it. This is one of the most anti-small business piece of legislation I've ever seen. Again, Section 1341 could repeal the Small Business Act. It could force millions of small businesses to close their doors. And this bill won't create one job. It's got the potential to force thousands of small businesses out of business. And, you know, the NFIB says it, the Congressional Oversight Committee says it, surveys by the American Small Business League. Sales, 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 sales is what small businesses need. There's not a word in this bill to do that. This was President Obama's last shot to stimulate the economy, and he blew it. It's just, it's loopholes for venture capitalists is what it is. Well, for over a decade, they've said that it's anomalies. So every day for over 10 years, the biggest companies in the world have gotten federal small business contracts. For example, last year, I think General Dynamics got $215 million. Verizon's been getting small business contracts for a decade, and they say it's due to anomalies and miscoding. But anomalies would be a random occurrence with a random pattern of distribution where an equal number of contracts that were miscoded
as where a large corporation would get a small business contract, we offset by a small business getting a large business contract. We don't see that. And the SBA press office for a decade has said, this is a myth. They said it's anomalies. The current head of the SBA press office, Terry Sutherland, has actually refused to comment to any journalist for a number of months. But it's clearly not anomalies. In fact, the truth about this comes from people like Professor Tiefer, from the SBA Inspector General, from the GAO. They say it's fraud, it's illegal. Nothing in federal law would allow the government to include contracts for Fortune 500 firms as small business contracts. Yet it's gone on every year for a decade. And I've written a bill in Congress called H.R. 1622, the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act. I've introduced it to Congress 3 times, and it's never made it out of committee. So when people in Washington talk about jobs, the facts are that the Census Bureau says that small businesses create over 90% of the net new jobs. And the 23% small business contracting program is actually the largest economic stimulus program in history to direct infrastructure spending to the middle class. And yet the program's been hijacked by Fortune 500 firms, and no legislation's been passed, no policies were adopted. In 2008, President Obama even released a statement that said that it's time in the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. And yet it continues. So it's time for somebody in government, for Congress or the Justice Department to step in, look at this issue, and in the fraud, because it is fraud. And again, that's what Professor Tiefer's opinion shows. That's what the SBA's own Inspector General has said. And that's what the Government Accounting Office has said. Well, I like to just stick to the facts. And the fact is that no federal law would allow the inclusion of Fortune 500 firms in the 23% goal. So when the government says they're going to hit the 23% goal, they're doing 2 things. The real federal acquisition budget is $1.1 trillion, which Professor Tiefer states in his legal opinion. They use a number that's half of that, less than half of that, which is around $500 billion. The other thing they do is include thousands of large corporations, Fortune 500 firms, overseas companies. So in reality, small businesses are getting maybe 5%. So for the government to claim that they're hitting the 3% goal is laughable when you include Fortune 500 firms. And there's no question, this is not an opinion. Anyone can go to the Federal Procurement Data System and look at the data, and it clearly shows that there are hundreds of Fortune 500 firms, foreign-owned companies, Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, even a Russian-owned arms dealer got small business contracts a few years ago, Roseboard Exports. The New York Times wrote a story about that. But again, the facts come from people like Professor Tiefer, the SBA Inspector General, the Government Accountability Office, and the misinformation comes from the SBA press office and people like Terry Sutherland that keep telling people that the government's hitting the goal, and that's just a lie. It's not true. And no investigation by either the media or any federal investigator has ever found that they're hitting the goal. It's never happened. So every investigation has found fraud for a decade. And Professor Tiefer's right. It's the Fortune 500 firms controlling the SBA. Think of the lunacy of that. Fortune 500 firms controlling the Small Business Administration. That's like letting Al Qaeda control, the Homeland Security.
We're going to the worst economic downturn in 80 years. Small businesses create virtually 100% of all net new jobs. They're responsible for half the gross domestic product, half the private sector workforce, and 90% of all U.S. exports. And Senator Burr wants to close the one agency to help America's top job creators. It's absurd. I think what it is, a power grab by Fortune 500 defense contractors. They're concerned that their piece of the pie is going to be shrinking. So if they can end federal programs for small businesses, they're going to take that money that should be going to America's chief job creators. I don't think Fran understands that the Small Business Act directs that 23% of all federal contracts should go to small businesses. That's $230 billion a year. That's the biggest job creation economic stimulus program that's ever passed for the middle class. And to eliminate that would be insane. You're talking about America's top job creators, the small businesses that create between 90 to 100% of all jobs, and you're going to eliminate the one agency to help them. That would be insane. And then give that money to the Fortune 500 corporations that haven't created one net new job in 30 years. It would be insane, I'm telling you. It would push America into a depression. I haven't found that to be true, but again, to tell you the truth, the main mission of the SBA is not the loan program. The main mission of the SBA is to make sure that this $230 billion in federal contracts gets in the hands of the middle class. I don't see why Fran is opposed to $230 billion a year in federal contracts going to the middle class. I don't see the downside. You know, what's the downside of that? They're obviously pulling the money on small business. It's been reported by the LA Times. It's an outrage. The purpose of TARP and all the economic stimulus programs was to give those banks money to give it to the small businesses. I think B of A got $90 billion, and now they're pulling the money. It's an outrage. I can't believe that Congress is allowing this to happen. I can't believe the president's allowing this to happen. And notice this. Notice who's not complaining. The groups around the country that claim to represent small businesses, not a peep out of them. The U.S. Chamber, because they don't represent small businesses. They represent Fortune 500 firms. It looks like it right now, particularly after they got $90 billion, but quite frankly, you've seen a pattern since TARP was passed where all the big banks are pulling back lending to small businesses. And that's the opposite of what they were supposed to do. The whole purpose of TARP was to give small businesses access to capital. Absolutely. That was the purpose of TARP. The purpose was to give that money to banks to give it to small businesses. But you know what? This is part of a pattern that you see in Washington of what I call anti-small business policies. You know, the government's giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. President Obama's dismantling the minority contracting program. You see kind of an anti-small business sentiment, I think, coming out of Washington. And if anyone disagrees, show me a policy in the last 5 years that has directed money to small businesses. Show me a program that's directed infrastructure spending to small businesses. Who of these 10% of people think they're doing a good job? Are they not watching television, not reading the newspaper? You know, I would think that the Congress's approval rating would be like, 0%. I mean, we've lost our AAA rating. The stock market's in chaos. Unemployment's still high. This country's going bankrupt. I love Obama's, was it his Jobs Council of all the Fortune 500 corporations that have shipped millions of jobs overseas? I think GE was the head of it, and GE has shipped more jobs overseas than any other country, or excuse me, any other business in the nation. It's crazy. Yeah, more and more small businesses are closing their doors.
Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, you're seeing more and more small businesses close their doors, and unemployment's going up. I don't think it's peaked yet, by the way. I think a lot of experts don't think unemployment's going to peak until this summer. So when I hear the recession's over, I just think that's ludicrous. It's not over for mainstream America. Well, I'm not a big fan of government statistics. And I think the government's trying to convince people that the recession's over. And they're not counting, as you said, people that have stopped looking for work and people that are underemployed. And I think that unemployment is closer to 20% than 10%, quite frankly. I also saw a program the other day that said a lot of retired people that have lost so much of their savings because of the recession, they're going to have to go back to work. So I just think it's ridiculous for them to say the recession's over, unemployment's going to keep going up. Look at it this way. According to the latest U.S. Census Bureau data, small businesses are responsible for over 95% of all net new jobs. And so far, of the two stimulus bills, small businesses have received less than 1%. And I think that's one reason we're still seeing unemployment go up. J.P. Morgan, for example, has gotten more money from the stimulus bill than all 27 million American small businesses combined. Mm-hmm. And I don't see anything changing, here in the near future. I like to see the government give small businesses more money from the stimulus, and I think the number one thing they could do is shift federal infrastructure spending to small businesses. There's a new bill in Congress right now, H.R. 2568, that would redirect $100 billion a year in existing federal infrastructure spending to small businesses. That bill would do more than anything that President Obama has proposed so far. Well, I think a really basic thing is to existing federal laws. They're on the books right now. Federal law says 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses. That's not happening. There's been about 20 investigations that show that most of that money goes to Fortune 500 firms. There's another law that says any federal acquisition under $100,000 should go to small businesses. That's not happening. Another federal law says 5% of government contracts should go to minority-owned companies. That program's being dismantled. And the thing that concerns me the most is President Obama's plan to combine the SBA with the Commerce Department. To me, that's really the same as closing the Small Business Administration, so I'm concerned about that. I guess the last thing is I thought the whole purpose of TARP, I saw President Bush, President Obama, and McCain on television talking about we need to pass TARP to increase access to capital for small businesses. And the truth is that since that was passed, access to capital has dropped. So I think President Obama and Congress need to do something to address that. tell you the truth, Obama talks about small business a lot, but when you look at what he does, I'm afraid he's actually dismantling all the federal programs for small businesses. The latest data that we've compiled from the government shows that the top 100 recipients of federal small business contracts, 70 are large businesses. So you're talking about companies like Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon, Finn Mechanica in Rome with 73,000 employees, Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, all getting federal small business contracts. And again, the move to combine the SBA with the Commerce Department, that's a 30-year-old thing that the large corporation have been trying to get to dismantle this federal program that directs 23% of the contracts to small businesses. So when you look at what he does, I don't see him doing anything that's pro-small business. I see him doing things that I would say are anti-small business. Well, you know, they've actually passed a number of programs that are supposed to encourage banks to lend to small businesses, but they really don't have any teeth in them. There's no downside to banks not lending to small businesses.
So we need an enforcement mechanism, or?
Yeah, absolutely. You need some enforcement mechanism, and increasing lending to small business needs to be tied directly to these banks getting help from the federal government. But again, there's been reports come out for 2 years now that lending to small businesses has dropped dramatically. Massachusetts small businesses should be getting about $2 billion a year in government small business contracts. They're probably getting maybe a fourth of that. I think the American people would be just stunned if they saw what was really happening with these small business contracts. President Obama would stop the government from diverting small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. It would put more money into the middle class and create more jobs than any economic stimulus program that President Bush or President Obama ever put forth. I don't think we've hit bottom yet. You're seeing small businesses closing every day. I was in Southern California just a few days ago, and about a half a dozen businesses that I frequented just 6 weeks ago have closed. So I think it's looking very bad for small business. I think it's going to get worse, and I don't think we've hit bottom yet. I doubt it. I think they're statistically insignificant. He's offered just a small handful of tax incentives, and in comparison to what the $2.3 trillion they've given Wall Street, it's just insignificant. You have to realize here in America, 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees, and those firms create 97% of the new jobs. I don't think you have to. I don't think you can say that until we clean up the credit markets, you know, small businesses aren't going to prosper, because, you know, a lot of small businesses aren't looking, you know, for loans. In fact, quite frankly, I think very few small businesses are out there looking for loans. A lot of small businesses are operating and doing fine. So I disagree with the opinion that we have to fix Wall Street before small businesses recover. Why don't we fix small businesses and Wall Street maybe simultaneously? What's wrong with that idea? Okay. I don't think so. I think it's too little too late. I think that people need to understand that 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees. They create 98% of all new jobs, and so far small businesses haven't gotten one dime from the stimulus bill. Their taxes are going to be raised. There's been no policies to stop the abuses in existing economic stimulus programs for small businesses, and it's been reported that President Obama is going to support policies to divert more federal small business contracts to venture capitalists. So I'm just not encouraged by it. Well, since 2003, over a dozen federal investigations have come out that have found that up to $400 million a day in federal contracts earmarked for small businesses have been diverted to Fortune 500 corporations. So if President Obama wants to do something for small businesses, he needs to make good on a February 2008 campaign promise when he said it's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. That would have a huge impact. That would be $100 million a year. That would do more for small businesses than anything that's been proposed so far. And it'd be real simple. He could do it with an executive order or a piece of legislation. Absolutely not. It's going to increase the deficit and cost America millions of jobs. He's claiming he's going to save $300 million a year by combining the SB and the Commerce Department. In the federal budget, that's peanuts. At the same time, he's increasing foreign aid by $9 billion. That's enough money to run the SBA for a decade. So Ronald Reagan actually tried to close the SBA twice back in his administration, and the way he was going to close it was to combine it with the Commerce Department. So make no mistake, President Obama's intention to combine the SBA with the Commerce Department is the same thing that Ronald Reagan was going to try to do, and close the agency, and in all the programs for the small businesses where most Americans work, and as you stated, over 90% of the net new jobs are created. You know, federal law says 23% of all federal contracts should go to small businesses. The federal government really spends over $1 trillion a year. So that means small businesses should be getting around $230 billion a year. Well, the big defense contractors and the military-industrial complex want that money. It's real simple. It's about greed. And the only way for them to get their hands on that money is to close the SBA. And once that happens, the big corporations will get 100% of all government contracts, all government spending. But the problem is they're not creating any jobs. And to do that would be devastating, to our economy and cost this country millions of jobs. Well, according to the federal investigations that have gone on in the last decade, they found that large corporations are committing felony federal contracting fraud by making what they call false certifications, improper certifications, and engaging in vendor deception, which is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And the large corporations misrepresent their subsidiaries and divisions as small businesses, and they're hijacking billions of dollars a month in contracts that should be going to the middle class where most Americans work, where all the jobs are created. And the SBA's own Inspector General has said the SBA is actually helping people to commit fraud. The Journal Accounting Office did an investigation a few years ago and also felt that the SBA was helping people to commit fraud. And this has gone on for over a decade, and you haven't seen any legislation policy to stop it. President Obama said he would stop it in February of 2008, but it's just gotten worse under his administration. And now he's going to try to close the SBA, I think, to try to cover it all up, actually. It's, you wouldn't believe me. It's just unbelievable. When you're trying to get stories out on major television networks about companies that are some of their major advertisers, it's just not going to happen. And I've had, I guess I've had maybe a half a dozen national news organizations do stories about this and then not run them. And I've had stories shot about me, and then they take me out of the story and run it. But it's you wouldn't believe it. It's like something out of a science fiction movie. When you're talking about the biggest corporations in the world and hundreds of billions of dollars in government contracts, there's just almost no limit to what they'll do to keep this story out of the press. It's astonishing. It's shocking. In fact, to tell you the truth, I'm stunned that I haven't seen it on the news. I think in 2011, IBM paid 1% in federal tax. ExxonMobil paid 2%. Of the 10 most successful U.S. corporations, the average tax rate they paid was 9%. And if we're trying to raise revenue, that's where we need to look. We don't need to raise taxes on the American people and close the only agency in Washington to help the small businesses where all the jobs are created. We need to make sure these large corporations are paying their fair share of taxes, and you're not seeing anyone in Congress even mentioning that. And of course, if I were in Washington, I would take a look at closing some of the 1,700 military bases we've got around the world. I don't think we need 1,700 military bases around the world these days, but they're not really, addressing these huge loopholes for corporations.
Absolutely.
Which I think would, it's about corruption in government, and it's about a plutocracy and a government that's run based upon money and contributions from the biggest companies in the world. That's what it's about. And the large companies get what they want, and the public, gets the short end of the stick every time. That's what it's about. Corruption, I think, in Washington. It's not random occurrences when every day for a decade, millions of dollars a day in federal contracts that by law should be going to small businesses are winding up in the hands of not only the largest corporations in America, but in Europe and even Asia. Absolutely. I actually think that President Obama, Congress, and a lot of people in the media are missing out on a very important point, and that is that small businesses create 90% of all net new jobs. And the programs President Obama are talking about really are going to shift money more to large corporations, which I think is really not going to work that much. And I think a lot of research has shown that the tax cuts are really not the most effective way to create jobs. If President Obama wants to create jobs, it's real simple, it's easy. He needs to take existing federal spending and direct it to small businesses. In fact, there's a federal law that says 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses. There's been a dozen investigations show that that's not happening. And small businesses are losing out on probably about $180 billion a year in contracts that should be going to them, but are being diverted to large corporations. So that would be the most effective way to take existing infrastructure spending Well, there's a number of reasons. The Inspector General for the SBA says that in many cases it's fraud. It's through loopholes that have been created that allow Fortune 500 firms and some of the biggest companies in Europe and Asia to get small business contracts. But President Obama could fix that tomorrow morning with an executive order. Our new SBA policy, he could simply say the federal government will no longer report awards to publicly traded firms as small business awards. He could do it a number of different ways, but it's really the most efficient, effective, deficit-neutral way. No new taxes, no new spending. Just quit giving federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. It'll create more jobs than anything he's ever spoken about.
Why has it been so hard for the small business community to get the president to listen to their pleas?
They're not giving money to his campaign. It's hard. It's very hard. Small businesses don't really have the voice in Washington that they should. Like I said, most Americans work for small businesses. But when you look at the economic stimulus in the last 2 or 3 years, small businesses have gotten maybe 3%. But it's really time for President Obama and Congress and the mainstream media to realize small businesses are the job creators of America. They are the engine of economic growth, and they need some money. They need their contracts. Well, no, I wouldn't say they're antiquated. The SBA is not what people think it is. You think the SBA is there to help small businesses. The SBA is there to help the government. So right now, while we're talking here in America, about $1 million a minute in government small business contracts are being diverted to large corporations around the world, and the Small Business Administration came up with those policies. So in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that the SBA is one of the most anti-small business organizations in the country. And it needs a complete overhaul from top to bottom. In fact, I was just reading today that G Capital is really in a similar situation of CIT, and the government backed $108 billion in bonds for them. CIT is the #1 lender to small business in America for 9 consecutive years, the #1 lender to women, minorities, and veteran-owned firms for 6 consecutive years. They've loaned money to people successfully that other banks, wouldn't work with. And I think they're way too valuable for the government to let them fail, and it wouldn't take that much to help them. They received $2.3 trillion, $2.3 billion in TARP funds.
That's right.
J.P. Morgan got $25 billion. It's important to remember that small businesses are responsible for half the GDP, 95% of the new jobs, and so far President Obama has given small businesses less than 0.5% of the $2.5 trillion in bailout funds, and CIT was one of the most effective vehicles for small businesses to get loans. All right, well, Professor Tiefer is one of the nation's leading experts on federal contracting law. He was a commissioner on the Commission on Wartime Spending in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's done extensive research, and his research really complies with what I've done and a lot of other people, which shows that the federal acquisition budget is actually $1.1 trillion. That's significant because federal law says that small businesses are supposed to get 23% of all government contracts, which would be around $253 billion a year. Well, the government is using a number that's less than half of the real acquisition budget, which is about $480, and they're claiming that last year small businesses got $89 billion, and most of that went to Fortune 500 firms. So that's around 198, maybe 200 billion a year. It's gone on for a decade. So you're talking about in the last 10 years, American small businesses have been cheated out of about $2 trillion. And that's just unbelievable. And it's, again, this is Professor Tiefer, one of the nation's leading experts, and he says it's fraud. And I agree with him completely. You're talking thousands of contracts. Last year, 235 Fortune 500 firms got federal small business contracts. And I'm afraid what's happening is I'm afraid President Obama is going to close the Small Business Administration within the next 30 days to try to cover up the abuses. His rationale for trying to close the SBA is to save $300 million a year. Well, that's ridiculous. At the same time, he's going to propose to close the SBA to save $300 million. He's going to spend $7 billion to build power plants in Africa, and literally trillions of dollars are unaccounted for at the Pentagon and the Federal Reserve. So it's ludicrous to close the only agency in America to help the 28 million small businesses that create over 90% of the net new jobs for $300 million. So when you look at Professor Tiefer's opinion, when you look at the investigations from the SBA's own Inspector General that Obama appointed, and all the other investigations that have been done by federal agencies and by the media, clearly there's rampant fraud and abuse at the SBA. Small businesses have been cheated out of over, I'll say right around $1 trillion, and I think President Obama is going to close the SBA to try to cover it up. Well, you know, basically I think the government's corrupt. I think what's happening at the SBA is systematic, what's happening at every agency, but it's about greed. These large corporations want that money. We're talking about, you know, $250 billion a year. They want the money. So they've lobbied Congress and worked with federal agencies to get policies, you know, to divert the money to them. And but it is kind of interesting that since Karen Mills resigned, by the way, he's appointed 270 people to fill vacant positions, but he hasn't filled anybody to take over the SBA. Again, I think that's very clear evidence that he's trying to close the SBA to cover up these rampant abuses. Not only has he not just explained it, but it's been uncovered by the major media. You won't see any stories in the mainstream media talking about the fact that he's appointed 270 people, but not anyone to head the SBA. You won't see anyone in the mainstream media mentioning that he's cheated small businesses out of over $1 trillion since he took office. These excuses about anomalies, it's really kind of comical. An anomaly would be a random occurrence, right?
Right.
Like getting hit by lightning or flipping a coin. And on a federal contract, you're either small or large. So if people were making random mistakes, half the time they would report an award to a small business as being a large business contract, and half the time they would report an award to a small business as being a large business contract. It would cancel itself out, right? We don't see that. Every year for a decade, we see billions and billions of dollars being reported as going to large corporations. So this excuse of anomalies and miscoding and computer glitches, it's absurd. And I think what really perturbs me is this has been going on for a decade. Right. And in 10 years, not one reporter in America has ever asked anybody in the government to explain why these supposed random anomalies always diverts federal small business contracts from small business and given to big businesses. Well, I'm afraid, I think everybody knows that the media in America is predominantly liberal. And I found that
predominantly liberal, come on, Lloyd, it's run by giant corporations who have profit-making motives.
Yeah. Well, let's just say this. When you see a liberal media outlet, they just won't do stories that are not flattering to President Obama. And, you know, to tell you the truth, I'll have to say I'm puzzled, really, why this is happening, but you just don't see it happening. If you go on YouTube, I've got a YouTube channel, Lloyd Chapman on YouTube, and look at the stories, you don't see a single story that questions this anomaly excuse. You don't see a single story that talks about the fact that small businesses have been cheated out of $1 trillion, and you don't see them mention the word fraud.